call off the quorum call, and I do have 8 unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you. I do have 8 unanimous consent requests I'd like to make before we proceed. I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I would ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-954, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 73, S-954, a bill to reauthorize agriculture programs through 2018.
Under the previous order, there are now 2 minutes of debate prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 965, offered by the senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders. Time is equally divided. Who yields time?
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
I want to thank Senators Begich, Blumenthal, Bennett, and Merkley for co-sponsoring this legislation, as well as many environmental and food organizations all over this country. The concept that we are talking about today is a fairly common sense and non-radical idea. All over the world, in the European Union, in many other countries around the world, dozens and dozens of countries, people are able to look at the food that they are buying and determine through labeling whether or not that product contains genetically modified organisms. That's what the issue is. In the state of Vermont, our legislature voted overwhelmingly for labeling in the state. The state Senate in Connecticut, by an almost unanimous vote, did the same. All over this country, states are considering this issue. One of the concerns that arises when a state goes forward is large biotech companies like Monsanto suggest that states do not have the constitutional right to go forward, that they're preempting federal authority. This bill makes it very clear states can go forward, and I would appreciate my colleagues' support for it.
Senator from Michigan.
First, Mr. President, before discussing the amendment, I think it's important to note that this is not germane to the Farm Bill, and food labeling is properly subject to the jurisdiction of the Health Committee, and therefore Senator Harkin opposes the amendment. I, too, while I appreciate very much the advocacy of Senator Sanders on so many different issues, I do believe that this particular amendment would interfere with the FDA's science-based process to determine what food labeling is necessary for consumers. It's also important to note that around the world now we are seeing genetically modified crops that have the ability to resist crop diseases and improve nutritional content and survive drought conditions. In many developing countries, we see wonderful work being done by foundations like the Gates Foundation and others that are using new techniques to be able to feed hungry people. I believe we must rely on the FDA's science-based examination before we make conclusions about food ingredients derived from genetically modified foods. They currently do not require special labeling because they've determined that food content of these ingredients does not materially differ from their conventional counterparts. So I would urge a no vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is on the amendment.
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donley, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Hirono, Murray, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Udall of New Mexico, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Crapo, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Kane, Moran, Risch, Sessions, Shaheen, Stabenow, and Warner. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Johans? No. Mr. Roberts? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Ayotte? No. Mr. Kirk? No. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Enzi? No. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Cruz? No.
I don't even have tickets. Thank you.
Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? No. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Mr. Coates? No. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Coburn? No. Mr. Nelson? No. Mr. McCain? No. Ms. Landrieu? No. Mr. Isaacson? No. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Heller? Mr. Heller? No. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Blunt? No. Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Casey? No. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? No. Ms. Warren? No. Mr. Carper? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Cowan? No. Mr. Hatch? No. Mr. Chambliss? No. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Corker? No. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? No. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Baucus? No. Mr. Pryor? No.
Mr. Portman? No. There you go. Well, I got, let's see, Hope. Mr. Hoven? No. Mr. Beckich? Aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 27, the nays are 71. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Lay it on the table.
Without objection?
Okay, where are we?
Now, Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I rise to make a unanimous consent motion, but I want to make a few remarks first. At the risk of being patronizing to my colleagues about the Constitution, I would like to give a basic lesson on the Constitution this morning.
Can we have order, please?
My understanding is that our founding fathers in the Constitution devised a system where we had a House of Representatives and a Senate. And they have to agree before something becomes a law. Now, I think this is an amazing decision that our founding fathers made. Because what this does, it requires that the Senate, where all of us represent a whole state, have to reach agreement with our colleagues in the House who have much smaller constituencies and therefore maybe targeted more to one specific area than some of us are. Now, I listen to lecture after lecture from my colleagues across the aisle about the Constitution. It's almost as if some of you think you're the only one that's read it, or you're the only one that understands it. Well, you're not. And here's how the Constitution works. When we pass a bill, and the House passes a bill, we go to conference. And why did the Founding Fathers want that? Because they understood that compromise was the mother's milk of a democracy. Now, here's the really bizarre thing about this. I bet I heard, as a candidate for office last year, 10,000 times, why don't you pass a budget? I listened to the leader of the Republican Party stand on this floor, and I'd love to put together a montage. Because, you know, we do a lot of hyperbole around here. We exaggerate. We go too far and say too much. But it is not exaggerating. The rallying cry of the Republican Party, pass a budget, regular order, pass a budget, regular order, pass a budget, regular order. And what did we do? We passed a budget in regular order. Now, here's the really bizarre part. Following the Constitution, that my friends like to wave around and pretend like they're the only ones that love it, we now have the nerve that some people on that side think regular order doesn't matter, and by the way, they don't want to go to conference and they don't want to compromise. Blowing up the constitutional premise of compromise between the two houses. Blowing it up. Now, I don't know what the American people think of this, but you've got to, like, shake your head at the politics of this. You've got to shake your head. Because here's what's really bizarre about this. They keep moving the goalposts about what it would take to get us to conference. And by the way, the people who are going to be conferring on the other side are the Republican Party. Are you so worried that they haven't read the Constitution and that they're not answerable to their constituents who voted them into office as Republicans? So, you know, we've got to have another budget bill and redo the debate, or we've got to make sure that they can't compromise on anything, and we've got to put it in the law. Now, there was an opportunity to get your way. It was called amendments. You could have gotten your way through the amendment process. We had over 100 of them. We were here till 5:30 in the morning voting on them. We passed 70 of them. Now, how many amendments do you think the senator from Texas offered on the debt ceiling that he's now saying he has to have before we can even go to conference? How many amendments do you think he offered on that? Zero. He offered 17 amendments, but he didn't offer one. In fact, there was not one Republican amendment on the debt ceiling. Not one. So I got to tell you, it's pretty obvious they didn't want a budget. They wanted a political talking point. They wanted to make it look like we didn't care about doing our job. They didn't care about a budget, because I'll tell you what, if you cared about a budget, you'd hightail it to conference right now. You would hightail it to conference. It's been 2 months. So I hope the American people are paying attention. No wonder they think we're all losers. This is not a game. And you can't love the Constitution one day and blow it up the next. You can't be a situational constitutionalist when you don't get your way. That's not the way our democracy works. I got elected fair and square, and so did you guys. And that's why we all have to be willing to compromise with one another. We are not serving the American people by playing these games, and they are sick and tired of it. And I think, frankly, it makes, you know, the body look a little silly. So I would, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 33, House Concurrent Resolution 25, that the amendment which is at the desk, the text of Senate Concurrent Resolution number 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof. That House Concurrent Resolution 25 as amended be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, that following the authorization, 2 motions to instruct conferees be in order from each side, motion to instruct relative to the debt limit, motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue, that there be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to votes in relation to the motions, further that no amendments be in order to either of the motions prior to the votes, all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I ask unanimous consent that the senator modify her request so that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit.
Will the senator so modify her request?
President, reserving the right.
Could I inquire of the senator? I'm asking, is the preventing a backroom deal, are you saying the constitutional provision for a conference between the two houses, you're saying that what the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution for conferences, that in fact is a backroom deal in the Constitution? You don't accept that part of the Constitution?
My friend and my distinguished colleague from Missouri is absolutely correct in citing the Constitution and pointing out the fact that the two houses do have to agree before something becomes law. It's also important to point out that under Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution, each House of Congress is constitutionally charged with the task of establishing its own rules for operation. The rules of operation in this body, as they apply right here, require that this kind of request receive unanimous consent. What that means is that every one of us has to be willing to vote for this. What I and a few of my colleagues have said is that regardless of what you might decide to do, we respect your opinion. But if you're asking us to vote for this, meaning to give our consent, which is a vote, we're asking for one slight modification. That slight modification includes something very simple, which just says we're not going to negotiate the debt limit as part of the budget resolution. They're two separate things. We didn't consider a single amendment that would have addressed the debt limit. Not a single part of the budget resolution that was passed out of this body addressed the debt limit. The debt limit not having been the subject of the budget resolution, it's not appropriate for that to be addressed by the conference committee.
Mr. President.
Will the senator so modify her request?
Mr. President, I'm reserving the right to object, and I will object to the
Senator from Arizona.
Well, first of all, I think that what is being done here, if we agreed that a small number of senators could basically change the way that the Senate does business, it could have serious ramifications for the future. The senator from Utah just said that he doesn't want to be deprived of his vote. We're ready to vote, I say to my colleague from Utah. We're ready to vote. We're ready to vote on a motion that would send this bill, which is the subject of enormous amount of debate and discussion for hours and hours till like 7 o'clock in the morning, to a conference with motions to instruct the conferees. I would be more than happy to vote on instructions to the conferees concerning his previous concern about tax increase, which somehow has been removed, and that of increasing the debt limit, instructing those conferees. That's the way that the Senate should do business. And if the senator from Utah will allow this body to vote on whether we should move to conference with instructions to conferees, that is the regular order. It is not the regular order for a number of senators, a small number, a minority within a minority here, to say that we will not agree to go to conference because of a particular problem with an issue which I grant is important to the senator from Utah. It's important to many senators as to whether we raise the debt limit or not. Well, what's to prevent? We're on the agriculture bill right now. I say to my colleague from Mississippi, suppose we pass the ag bill. Suppose that the House of Representatives pass the ag bill and we want to appoint conferees. But there is a burning issue that a number of my colleagues might have, and so we're then going to block going to conference. Look, this isn't just about the budget conferees. This is about whether we will ever be able to appoint conferees on a bill that's been passed by the House and also by the Senate, and that we will come together and do what we have been doing since this body since the Congress of the United States started functioning, and that is to sit down and iron out our differences. Now, if the senator from Utah is worried about the result, I understand. I'm worried about the result. I'm worried about a bill right now that is just outrageous in pork barrel spending and catfish and all kinds of stuff that I have concerned about, subsidies for the tobacco companies and all that. But that does not mean that I am going to object that we move for conferees when the will of the Senate and the Congress and the people is heard in open and honest debate and voting. We're here to vote. We're not here to block things. We're here to articulate our positions on the issues in the best and possible and most eloquent way we can, and do what we can for the good of the country, and then let the process move forward. I say to my friend from Utah, you're not going to win every fight here. You're not going to win every battle here. But if you are right, I can tell you from the experience I've had over here in the United States Senate, you will win in the end if your cause is just. But you can only win if you articulate your argument before your colleagues here in the Congress and the American people. We're about to, I hope, conclude the immigration reform bill. There will be portions of that bill that I don't like. There will be portions of that bill that many of my colleagues won't like. But we're not counting on 100 votes in the United States Senate, but we are counting on a majority of votes and passing it. And we're hoping that the House will do the same. And then we will go to conference. Now, does that mean that if a group of senators, 4, 5, 10, I don't know how many colleagues you have on this issue, object to us going to conference on the immigration bill, that therefore it should stop? I am very worried if this happens about the precedent that will be set on how the Congress of the United States does business. Now, just a few weeks ago, after the Newton massacre, my colleague from Utah and my colleague, I believe, from Florida, I'm not sure who else, said, we don't want to take up the gun bill. We don't want to discuss the gun bill. I happen to have disagreed with many of the proposals, but was it right? Would it have been right for us not even to debate in light of the Newton massacre? But the senator from Utah thought it was the best thing for us not to move forward. Thank God there was a group of us that said, let's move forward. Let's debate the gun bill. Let's do what we can to prevent these further massacres. That's our obligation and our duty to the American people. So here we are again. The budget that for 4 years, I love beating the daylights out of my friend from Missouri who would not insist on a budget being brought to the floor of the Senate. Now a budget has been passed. Everybody was talking about what a great moment it was that we stayed up all night. My age, that's not nearly as enjoyable as it once was. And now after being so proud that we can't observe at least a vote, if the senator from Utah wants a vote, whether he should appoint conferees or not, and what those instructions of the conferees should be, then that's what we should be doing. And I understand how important it is to senator from Florida, the senator from, I don't know how many there are, but I can tell you there's a majority of us that want the Congress to work the people's will. And so all I would do is say, look, I hope that my colleagues will agree with motions to instruct the conferees. If it is the senator from Utah's concern that the conferees should not address the issue of the debt ceiling, then let's vote to instruct the conferees to do that. That's the regular process. That's a regular order around here. But I can also tell my colleague from Utah something else. If we continue to block things like this and block what is the regular order, then the majority will be tempted to change the rules of the Senate. That would be the most disastrous outcome that I could ever imagine. And I don't begrudge anybody, whether they've been here 6 months or they've been here 30 years, their rights as senators. But I hope my colleagues would look at the way the Senate has functioned in the past. Are the American people unhappy with us? Of course they're unhappy with us. One reason is because they don't see us accomplishing anything. What I have done for these years and the people that I've respected in this body on both sides of the aisle, you fight the good fight. You make your case to your colleagues and the American people, and then you accept. You accept the outcome of a regular order while preserving your rights as an individual senator. We have maintained that balance to a large degree. I hope that my colleagues will understand how important that is, and I would urge my colleagues to do what we've been doing, and that is to have motions to instruct the conferees. If their issue is taxes, if their issue is the debt ceiling, then we vote to instruct those conferees, and those conferees carry out the will of the majority of the United States Senate.
Mr. President.
Is there objection to the modified request?
Mr. President?
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
I reserve the right to object to the request made by the senator from Utah to amend my request, and I would say that within my request there is, in fact, the opportunity to vote, and he had the opportunity to offer an amendment on the debt ceiling in the budget, and he did not. So I certainly thank my colleague from Arizona, and I renew my unanimous consent motion.
Mr. President, if I might.
Is there objection to the modified request?
There is an objection to the modified request.
The objection is heard. The senator from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. Just for 30 seconds, this is a very important debate. I'm not trying to interrupt it, but I do have, just for purposes of our colleagues who want to speak next, ask that once the debate is done, that Senator Feinstein, Senator McCain have 15 minutes to discuss a Farm Bill amendment. Thank you.
Without objection.
Mr. President?
Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
The senator from Utah.
For 61 days, several of my colleagues and I have objected to the majority's request for unanimous consent to circumvent regular order, to go to conference with the House on the budget. They want permission to skip a few steps in the process and jump straight to the closed-door backroom meetings. There, senior negotiators from the House and the Senate will be free to wait until a convenient artificial deadline and ram through their compromise, unamended, undebated, and mostly unread. And with the country backed up against another economic cliff crisis, we're concerned they will exploit that opportunity to sneak a debt limit increase into the budget. We think that's inappropriate. And yet, objecting to this dysfunctional, un-Republican, undemocratic process has invited anger and criticism from colleagues here on both sides of the aisle. We just don't get it, you see. We just don't get it, we're told. Proceeding to a secret closed-door backroom 11th hour deal, we're told, is the way the process works. It's the way the Senate works. It's the way the House works. It's the way Washington works. We know this. That's why we're objecting. In case nobody has noticed, the way Washington works stinks. Closed-door backroom cliff deals are not the solution. They're the problem. The unspoken premise of every argument we've heard in favor of going to conference on this budget without conditions is that Congress knows what it's doing. Trust us to go back into a back room and cut a deal. Trust us to ignore special interests and only work for the good of the country. Trust us to not wait until the 11th hour, to not hold the full faith and credit of the United States hostage, to not ram through another 1,000-page trillion-dollar bill sight unseen. Trust us, we're Congress. As it happens, Mr. President, the American people don't trust Congress or either party, and we've given them at least 17 trillion reasons not to do so. I can provide physical evidence to support my claim. If the American people had confidence in the way the Senate works, I know for a fact I wouldn't be here. I don't think my colleagues joining me in this objection would be here either. We were not sent here to affirm the way the Senate worked as Congress racked up trillions in debt, inflated the housing bubble, doled out favors to special interests, squeezed the middle class, and trapped the poor in poverty. We were sent here to change that. We're fully aware that Washington and the establishments within both parties don't like what we're saying. But as computer programmers are sometimes inclined to say, that's a feature, not a bug. The tactics of Washington serve the interests of Washington, of Congress itself, the federal bureaucracy, corporate cronies, and special interests. And it does so at the expense of the American people, their wallets, and their freedom. The only time I can think of when it hasn't worked out that way was with the recent budget sequestration. And that was literally an accident, a mistake. The sequestration process worked out exactly the opposite of how Washington expected and intended. There is a reason, Mr. President, that 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States are suburbs of Washington, D.C., a city that produces almost nothing in real, tangible economic value. And it's not because the two parties have been so effective taking on the special interests and doing the people's business. There's a reason the Tea Partiers on the right and the occupiers on the left protest their shared perception that our economy, our politics, and our society seem rigged. That elites on Wall Street, K Street, and Pennsylvania Avenue get to play by one set of rules and the people on Main Street must play by another. It's because they're mostly right. This is our true inequality crisis, not between rich and poor, but between Washington and everyone else in America. The national debt and its statutory limit is a hidden part of this inequality crisis. After all, what is new debt but a tax increase of sorts on future Americans, on those who in some cases cannot yet vote, on those who in some cases have yet to be born? Raising the debt limit thus results in a really pernicious form of taxation without representation. That's why the American people resent it. And it's why Washington desperately wants to raise the debt limit with as little public scrutiny and as little accountability as possible. And that's why we're objecting. Now, our critics say that we should allow the process to move forward so we can have a debate. I don't know if they've noticed, Mr. President, but we're having the debate. We've had it for several days in a row. And more than that, we're having the debate here on the floor, open to public scrutiny, and not secretly behind closed doors. This, right here, is how the process is supposed to work. The only way the American people can have any hope in supervising their Congress, not ours, their Congress, is for us to do our work above board and in the open according to the rules. That's all we're asking for. And only on this one issue. For all our concerns, we have still said all along that we will not block a budget conference. We can go to conference right now on the budget, right this very moment. We're willing to give the majority permission to break from regular order and scurry off to closed-door negotiations to cut their backroom deal. All we've asked is this one thing, a very small and simple request. Leave the debt limit out of it. Do everything else you want. Spend all the money you want. Use all the accounting gimmicks you want. But when you go into that back room, check the debt limit at the door. That way, the American people can have that separate debate on its merits here on the floor. This should not be controversial. The House Republican budget did not include a debt limit increase or instructions to include one. The Senate Democratic budget doesn't include it either. House and Senate negotiators, therefore, have no procedural or democratic justification for including a debt limit hike in their tasks. They have no right to do it, yet they won't promise not to. Once again, Mr. President, it's a message of trust us. We're Congress. This is how the Senate works, they say. This is how we do things. This is how we've always done things. Respectfully, Mr. President, this is how we fail. This is how we earn our 15% approval rating. We know this is business as usual around here. That's why we're objecting. If the majority wants to proceed to a budget conference through regular order, we cannot stop them. But again, Mr. President, that's not their request. Their request is for permission to break from regular order, skip a few steps, and go straight into secret negotiations behind closed doors, where in the Washington-centered view of the world, the real governing can be done. The American people do not trust secret backroom deals, and neither do I. Unless and until the American people are assured that we will not sneak a debt limit increase into the conference report, I will happily continue to object, and I object to the motion on the floor.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, just briefly, we've been through it before. In a nutshell, what the senator from Utah has just said, that is, if we pass legislation, if the House passes legislation, that we will not go to conference unless certain conditions are imposed on those conferees that happen to be important to a small group of the United States senators. obviously that will paralyze the process here. Obviously, you can predict the outcome. The senator from Utah keeps talking about backroom closed-door deals. It's the process of the Senate to appoint conferees and the House to appoint conferees, and those conferees come to agreement and then subject their agreement to an overall vote of both bodies. If the senator from Utah wants to get rid of the, quote, backroom, all of the other adjectives and adverbs that he used, then what is the process? What is the process? How do we reconcile legislation that's passed by one body and the other body? That's what we've been doing for a couple of hundred years.
Senator, yield for a question.
So all I can say is the senator from Utah got another way of reconciling legislation between the House and the Senate? Of course not. Of course he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. Because that's the only way that we can get legislation that will be passed by both bodies and signed by the President of the United States. That's the only way. And I tell the senator from Utah again, if this is imposed, this condition is imposed, then there is no reason why any group of senators should impose conditions on conferees from now on, which will then mean, of course, that we won't go to conference. So I'd be glad to answer a question.
I'd like to ask the senator from Arizona a question through the chair. It's my understanding the budget resolution passed by the House, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, if conferenced and agreed upon, will result in a resolution passed by both the House and Senate, but never sent to the President. It is a budget resolution that governs the way we appropriate from that point forward. So the question of the debt ceiling, it couldn't be done in a budget resolution. If there's going to be any action on the debt ceiling, it has to be in a separate legislative vehicle that ultimately goes to the President of the United States. So even if there were an agreement on debt limit in the budget conference, it would have no impact of law.
Well,
is that not true?
Well, perhaps the senator from Utah doesn't know about that. The fact that it couldn't, even if they did raise the debt limit, it could not become law because it doesn't go to the President of the United States. So again, maybe the senator from Utah ought to learn a little bit more about how business has been done in the Congress of the United States. Budget resolutions are not signed by the President of the United States, so even if we did vote to increase the debt limit as